Hi everybody, and welcome to the current state of mobile testing. Today we're going to talk about mobile software testing and how you can become a great mobile software tester. So, I will be in Test Huddle for about an hour after this presentation, so if you have any questions then please jot them down and I'll be able to answer them over there at Test Huddle. So let's get started. So, I've been working in mobile software testing for about 14 years and I've tested devices, networks and applications for companies like Ericsson and Motorola and Nokia. I work at the moment for the Net-a-Porter group, who are a luxury fashion e-commerce and m-commerce retailer. I have a website and a fairly active blog, and you can follow me on Twitter, so if you have questions which we don't get to in Test Huddle, for example, then Twitter is also a good place to get hold of me. I also help curate a software testing podcast together with Dan Ashby called Testing in the Pub. And you can get that from www.testinginthepub.com or follow us on Twitter. We're also on iTunes as well. So if you want to subscribe via iTunes, search for us, Testing in the Pub. We record our own conversations about testing and what we feel is important in testing. And also we interview leading figures in the testing world. So if you're interested in podcasts, you want to learn a bit more, it's a good place to go. So, let's get started. So, today, we're going to look first at a little bit of history. So, where we've come from with mobile. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of mobile itself and give you some useful information there and explain to you why mobile is different. So, why mobile is not the same maybe as some testing you may be used to. I'll give you an idea of where we are now in the world of mobile and mobile testing. I'll also tell you what's coming next, so where I see the next big things in mobile and the effect that will have on testing. And finally, I'm going to hopefully give you some advice which will help your mobile testing future. So hopefully give you some advice to help you avoid some of the common mistakes that are made when starting to test in mobile. And remember, I'll be over in Test Huddle after this, so if you have questions, jot them down and let's continue the discussion in Test Huddle when I've finished. So a little bit of history. Well, where did we come from with mobile? This is a Motorola, I believe, mobile radio telephone, so a car phone essentially. And mobile started in cars. You could say that's kind of mobile, but not massively mobile. But mobile as we know it really started with this guy. This is a guy called Martin Cooper, and he was a researcher and an executive at Motorola, and he's the guy who made the first mobile telephone call from a handheld piece of equipment way back in April 1973. So a while ago, but not that long ago, let's be perfectly honest. I mean, what, 30 years ago, just over 30 years ago? So Motorola was the first company that produced a handheld mobile phone. But in that 30 years, we've come a very, very long way. And if we look at all the stuff this cool 80s guy here has got, you can do all of that now with a smartphone. So he's got a lot of stuff there, and all of that now can be done with a smartphone. So people are essentially carrying around a mobile computer, a small mobile computer in their pocket. And that presents us with a number of very unique testing challenges, which I hope I'll go through and explain to you in this webinar and give you some of the solutions as well. So let's kind of start from the beginning. Let's start from what we think of mobile devices as being. So they can be smartphones. So smartphones, typically there are third-party developers writing applications that run natively on the operating system. A lot of us have smartphones, particularly in the developed world. But in the developing world, whilst smartphones are beginning to become more prevalent, feature phones are mostly used. And these are simpler, typically running operating systems which are not open, and so typically less or no third-party applications for these. But they still sell in millions and millions, particularly in the developing world. Tablets, over the last couple of years, have become very, very popular, and these present testing challenges as well. There's more screen real estate on a tablet, and therefore the functionality of a tablet application is typically different. And then we've also got things like e-readers as well. And what we're looking at here is big screens and small screens and touch screens, keypads. Basically, lots of different combinations of hardware. That has a testing challenge. And increasingly now, we're moving over more to wearable devices. So fitness devices, for example, smartwatches becoming really big this year, particularly with the launch of Android Wear as a platform. And also things like wearable cameras, for example, beginning to become bigger. And even creeping into things like shops. I mean, beacons are little Bluetooth low energy devices which retailers can use to communicate with your mobile. And household gadgets as well. I mean, Google bought Nest, for example, make thermostats. All of these, I would argue, mobile devices as well, and all of these present unique testing challenges. But to the user, mobile devices are much, much more than this. So they are alarm clocks and maps. They're the link to the people that we love, ultimately. And we can do a heck of a lot on a mobile device in terms of retail, commerce, playing music, reading, playing games, taking pictures. And these are all really, really key experiences for people. And that means one thing. It means mobile is different. So mobile is different to the web, and it's different to the desktop. For one thing, you've got actual real hardware. So you can drop a mobile, it can get wet. You can remove things from mobile phones. You can take the battery out of some mobile phones, SD cards, SIM cards. All of these things which you maybe can't do in the desktop world or the web world. And mobile is consumer electronics, so it's a very fast-paced industry. And people are almost defined by their devices. You get this idea of device jealousy. I want what that person's got. And what this does is, this makes mobile users more emotionally attached. So people get more emotionally attached to their mobile devices. Often they're the first thing they see in the morning when their alarm goes off. And quite frequently they're the last thing they see at night as well, when they plug them into the chargers, battery life not being what it used to be, and then settle down to go to sleep. And this emotional attachment affects their perception of quality of applications. It also affects how people see themselves. People almost classify themselves by what device they carry. It becomes a part of them. And this little cartoon here kind of shows how maybe some users see other users. And all of this it affects their perceptions of quality, and their perceptions of quality are what we need to be really, really aware of when we're testing. So when we're putting ourselves in the mind of the user. And these users, they're not second-class citizens anymore. It used to be okay that your mobile device or your mobile app experience was maybe not quite so good as your desktop. Not anymore. Mobile users want an optimized experience, but they don't want less. And so it's no longer okay to give them an experience which is suboptimal. Mobile users won't put up with this anymore. They may be used to when things were newer, but not anymore. So things like this are no longer really acceptable. Things like this will cause people to drop particular products and go to other places. We have to remember that users use mobiles typically when they don't have access to other technology. So maybe they're out of the office, maybe they're on a train, or maybe they're in the pub. And so asking them to do actions such as switch to desktop sites, which are either not usable on their mobile or very, very difficult to use on their mobile, is no longer okay. And asking users to go to a desktop website full stop, not so good. This is no longer really okay. But this is the thing with mobile. The quality is still not brilliant. It's maybe improving, but it's still not great. And apps and even mobile devices are still launched without enough testing. I mean, if anybody remembers the iPhone 4 with the death grip, the way you could hold your iPhone in a particular way which caused the signal to drop, that caused Apple to have to ship out $15 a piece plastic cases to everybody in order to fix it. Apple didn't exactly get the maps brilliant in iOS 6, and they suffered a lot of brand erosion as a result. Mobile users have a far higher expectation of mobile apps than they do maybe of say browser applications. And the surveys out there saying things like almost 80% of users delete an app after using it for the first time if it's got bad design, usability, maybe it takes too long to load or it crashes after installation. And so users want something that's quick. They want something that feels fast, they want something that's really usable and that's mobile optimized. And as testers, we need to think about that as we test mobile applications and also mobile websites. And one reason this is really important is because it's much easier in the mobile world to leave very bad, very visible feedback very quickly. In fact, platforms like Android, for example, and iOS, they almost encourage this behavior. So encourage commenting in app stores. And particularly for applications where there are a lot of competing applications, users look at the reviews in the app stores and maybe they go somewhere else if you've got bad reviews. App stores can also be a good way of starting a discussion with your user as well. So increasingly we're seeing companies respond to bad reviews in app stores, and it can be a good way of getting consumer feedback. Maybe a bit late, but better than nothing. The key thing here, and we should think about this when we test, is your brand is your brand. It doesn't matter which platform you're on. So what makes mobile testing different? Some of the things that makes mobile testing different. We'll touch on a lot of these as we go through the webinar. So there are many platforms in mobile. There's iOS, there's Android, there's BlackBerry, Windows Phone to a certain extent. So a lot of platforms. There's lots of different versions of operating systems in the field, particularly in the Android case, but quite a few versions of iOS as well. So a lot of different combinations to test. There are many different hardware configurations too. So many different sorts of phones, sizes of screen, ways of inputting text and data. All of these have an impact on what we test. And these devices have limited memory and processing capability. So they're little computers, but let's not forget, they don't have the capability of a larger desktop machine, and therefore consequently they're prioritizing requests in the OS, and that can have an impact on the application that you're testing. They have limited battery life as well, and applications which use too much battery are often the ones which are least popular. They connect to the network. The network is not always 100% reliable. There are different ways of connecting to the network, maybe cellular or over Wi-Fi, for example, or Bluetooth in some cases. And users download these applications from application stores, and there are many different application stores to download from, and even that piece of functionality of download and install and uninstall is relatively unique in terms of speed for mobile. And then finally, automation solutions are not where they are in the desktop world and the web world for mobile yet. And I will talk a lot more about that towards the end of the webinar. The good news, particularly if you're coming to mobile testing from, say, web testing, is there's a lot that you can carry over. And particularly, let's look at a typical kind of functional aspect. Let's look at this. This is the Mr. Porter shopping application. So if you're looking at this and you're thinking, we could be testing whether I could select those categories. Maybe there's an account section in here. There's a shopping bag, so maybe I'll test that shopping bag, test whether that works okay. I'll open and I'll close the app, and I'll look at the images. All of these sorts of things, equally important. But what you really need to think about as well is the usability of that particular application. So it's more important in the mobile world. Screens are smaller. they are more difficult to interact with. As we can see here, typically mobile phone users are holding their phone in one hand and using the thumb of that hand to interact. So understanding this, when you're testing a mobile application, use it like you think the users are going to use it, because that will discover usability issues in the application, and that's what's really, really important. Usability is really, really key in mobile. So I've already said understand the user quite a bit, and it's very, very important in mobile, particularly because applications are launched and distributed to millions of people. If you've got a good popular application, there could be millions of people using it, and you can you can't go out and ask all of these people for their opinions. But what you can do, and particularly in applications and mobile websites, is you can look at analytics. So you can get an idea of what sort of devices customers are using. You can see how long they spend in particular parts of applications or particular parts of the mobile websites. Hopefully you can get this information for the application either you're working on or very similar applications that are already launched. You could look at maybe thinking about user personas. So a user persona is kind of a fictional version of a person that helps you understand typical users. Make friends with any UX people you have where you work. Ask them about this sort of stuff. I bet they will be really, really happy to share it. And then finally, maybe think about similar applications. So if you haven't got an application in the field, think about one that's already out there that is pretty similar. Now, I'll be talking much, much more about this in November at EuroSTAR. So if you haven't already got your ticket, definitely recommend you sign up for that. So along with usability, users are looking for consistency. They're looking for kind of that feeling of security that they're using an application which feels like something they're used to. So maybe something that is similar to the desktop, for example, consistent branding, but also something that takes advantage of mobile functionality. So it takes advantage of location, for example, mobile search, maybe mobile commerce. And very, very key, they're looking for something that they can use on a small screen, and they're likely to be using outside as well. So don't forget about usability and visibility in bright light, because it's all about how they engage with your app. So people now are typically having maybe more than one device. They've maybe got a phone and a Kindle, or a phone and a smartwatch, or sometimes two phones. So they get distracted easily, and what you need is an application or a mobile website that really engages them. So think about that when you're testing. Think about, is it engaging me? If I was a bit distracted, would I be paying attention to this, or would I be paying attention to something else? Because that's what really makes an application give that sense of wow. Another thing that can help there is gestures. So mobile comes with its whole alternative language, and particularly around different gestures. So do some research and find out about all of these different gestures, and find out what gestures your application supports. So gone are the days where it was just tapping and double tapping. There's all manner of other gestures which you can do, and good app developers can take advantage of. And as good app testers, we need to be aware of those too. So from a mobile specific perspective, there's a couple of other things to look at in terms of downloading and installing applications and then uninstalling them. Maybe does all the data get removed when you uninstall? Can you upgrade the application? Very important. Sometimes it happens automatically, sometimes manually. Think about rotating screens. There's a very buggy area typically when the layout changes with screen rotation. Think about whether your application uses other sensors within the device. Maybe the accelerometers, maybe the GPS, for example. Maybe some light sensors. Think about those. Think about how you would test and how you would control those sensors in some predictable way. Think about location, and think about external media. So if your application can write to an SD card, and that SD card in some devices is removable, what happens when that SD card is not there? Or what happens when that SD card is removed while it's being written to or read from? As I mentioned earlier, mobile devices are low power, they are multitasking, and they're doing a heck of a lot while you're using an application, particularly in terms of talking to the network and figuring out where you are, maybe doing some updating over a data connection. So there's a heck of a lot going on, and you have to be really aware that you want to be trying all of these different interactions as well as just testing in perfect conditions. So get some interactions going, get some data flowing maybe, interrupt your application with calls and text and music and video, potentially. Think about locking and unlocking the screen. What happens to the application? Because from a performance perspective, mobiles are limited. Their processor speeds are limited. They have this limited onboard memory. Another very important point is that they're typically not turned off very often. So consequently, memory leaks in applications become very visible. So make sure you do some kind of long-term app tests for an application, because you don't want to be getting that feedback back from customers a couple of weeks after launching. The good news is apps are typically quite often just clients of web services. So if you've got some web performance testing skills and some API testing skills, think about employing those on the APIs before testing the app. Don't feel that you need to test everything necessarily via the application itself. And mobile applications, typically talking via APIs, they're exchanging data. So think about excessive data consumption. Think about using applications on the device. Most OSs have this now, that enable you to check for excessive data consumption, because you can be sure your users are going to start complaining if your app is using excessive data. People typically don't have unlimited data in their mobile contracts. If you haven't got these, maybe think about using a proxy and just getting an idea of how much data is being transferred. So, let's have a little think now about the current state of where we are in the world of mobile, because this really impacts how we go about testing. There's a lot of mobile cellular subscriptions, as you can see here. I mean, we're up at almost the number of people on the planet, which is kind of interesting. 6.8 billion, probably a little bit more since this stat was taken. So there are mobile devices and there are mobile subscriptions everywhere. It's huge. And 1.8 billion devices shipped last year. So primarily from Samsung, this is by volume. Nokia, of course, now part of Microsoft. Apple still make the most money, even though they ship less devices. So their average selling price significantly higher. So their market share by volume looks lower, but their market share by value is much higher. But the key thing here is lots and lots and lots of devices out there. And that means your application could be deployed on lots of different devices. Increasingly as well, it's all about smartphones and tablets. So as you can see from this here, this shows the primary operating system in each particular territory. So a lot of Android, a lot of iOS, particularly in the States and parts of Europe and Russia. Series 40, a Nokia feature phone operating system, still holding on in a few places in Africa where there are more feature phones at the moment, although that's rapidly changing. And Android is really the dominant OS worldwide by volume. So more Android phones than any other. This presents a unique testing challenge for us because obviously we need to make sure we've got coverage of the right number of those devices. If you're testing a mobile website, here's an interesting stat for you. The most used browser at the moment worldwide is actually the Android browser. So not the Chrome browser that ships by default in later versions of Android, but the default Android browser. So this is also, I think, driven by a lot of devices that are developed using the open source version of Android, rather than the one that's controlled by Google with Google services. If you look at your device stats when you've got an application in the field, it will give you a good idea of where all your traffic is coming from. If you haven't got that, a site like StatCounter is good to get more general statistics. So, that's where we are at the moment, but where are we going? What's the future? What's coming up? Here's my kind of crystal ball into the future. First one, there will be more devices. So we're in the consumer electronics business, basically. There will be a lot more devices. They will be faster. They will be probably bigger. The key thing here is, does this mean more testing? It means being more clever with what we test on and how we test, not necessarily more testing. I think we will see more wearables. 2014 really seems to be the year of the smartwatch, for example, particularly with Google Wear coming out. This means more interaction between devices. Smartwatches typically need a smartphone to talk to, and this means more difficult test scenarios for us. It also means more users becoming multi-device, and therefore more distracted and ultimately more time poor. So apps really need to grab people's attention. If we look at the OSs as they are currently at the moment, as kind of touched upon earlier, Android really being the prevalent one, and iOS, and they're both kind of increasing, and I think we'll begin to see the death of BlackBerry and Windows Phone. Their margins, their user base is really beginning to decrease now. So it's really a two-horse race at the moment. And remember, iOS makes more money than Android, but there are many more people making Android devices. What this means is we have a problem called fragmentation. So there are a lot of different versions of Android in the field and a lot of different hardware versions and different hardware functionality. And that can make it sometimes a little difficult from a testing perspective. I'll give you some hints and tips on what you can do to solve this as we go on in the webinar. Because, as you can see from this, and this doesn't take into account Apple is probably going to launch a new size of iOS device very soon, but there are many, many more different screen sizes of Android device, and that also affects what we test. So it's not just about platform version or even platform, it's also about screen size, for example. So how do you decide what to test? That's the key thing. You can't test everything. So the key thing, as touched on earlier, know your predicted customers and your current ones. So not just your current ones, but have a kind of an idea of who you think your predicted customers are. Talk to your product owner. They should know. There should be somebody in your business who knows. Make friends with your UX people. Find out what operating system updates are coming up. So you can subscribe to developer notices from Google and from Apple, for example. So you get an idea of what's coming up. Maybe you get access to preview versions that you can use to test your app against. And get as much data on device usage as you can, as I mentioned earlier, from analytics, searches, similar applications, maybe some of the statistics that I showed earlier. So fill yourself with data, because that can really be used to drive your testing. Because this fragmentation thing, and all of this different hardware and this different software configurations to support, you've got some options, because clearly you need to test on something, and what do you test on? So you could decide to use no real devices at all and just use simulators or user agents. Now, this can be an okay strategy if you're just looking to test the UI of your application, but it's a far too risky strategy if you're trying to test more than your UI, because your device is so complicated and simulators are not able to effectively simulate exactly what's going on. You should buy some devices, therefore. You probably can't buy all of them. There are some other options. One of those is renting. So there are companies who will rent devices to you. This can be useful for making sure that if you know what your top devices are, you know what your users are using, you can get hold of those devices and test with them. There are cloud-based services like Perfecto Mobile Device Anywhere who host devices, and you can test using a web browser. So for me, I'd go for, as I've said here, 2 from the top, 2 from the middle, and 2 from the bottom. So buy some real devices, buy some quick ones, some expensive ones, buy some really cheap ones, and buy a couple in the middle. And then you've probably made sure that you've got at least an okay coverage across the devices that your users are going to be using. So understand what they'll use and buy the ones that you see and the ones that you think will come out? Because users are typically on a 2-year upgrade cycle. So there's a lot of old stuff in the field as well as the newest, fanciest devices. Don't just buy the new ones. Testing first on simulators is okay, but don't just test on simulators. And if you need to use cloud services to fill gaps, just make sure that you do a trial with those providers, because there have been issues with latency, for example, which means that they are sometimes maybe a little difficult to use, and they're certainly more difficult than using a real device. And finally, never use browser emulation for mobile websites only. Even if it's just testing it across a single device that you have, please do that. One thing you can also do, and we should be doing more in the future, is making more use of our users. So think about dog fooding and alpha and beta programs, because applications are distributed when they're live to a huge number of people. But you've probably, where you work, you've probably got a fair spread of people on different devices. Get an internal user group going. Distribute pre-release versions to your users, your friends, your colleagues. And there are applications like TestFlight and TestFairy, for example, that allow you to do that. Some of the application stores allow you to set up beta tests. So basically, form your own crowd. And if you can't form your own crowd, think about using maybe one of the companies that can. It can be a very cost-effective way of ensuring that you've lowered the risk of an app launch by having the application tested on a large number of different devices. Consider using these cloud-based services where appropriate, as I've mentioned. And don't buy all the devices. It's not about buying all the devices. You can never buy all the devices. And even if you did buy all the devices, in 2 or 3 months' time, you would need to buy a whole bunch more devices. So a mobile test lab it's not just for Christmas. It's something that needs regular maintenance, and that costs money. The great thing is that there's a new idea come out, and they're called Open Device Lab. And this is where companies who have a number of devices have said, okay, we'll open up our device lab to anybody who wants to book in and come into our offices, maybe buy us coffee and a few donuts or something, and use our devices for free. And these are great. This shows where there are device labs in the UK. There are mobile and open device labs across the world now, and it's getting increasingly prevalent. So think about using these. And if you've got a number of devices, think about opening one yourself. These are a brilliant idea to make sure that people get access to devices that they need to test with. I think in the future we will also see applications becoming more location and aware and really kind of leveraging that location. So shopping apps, for example, that if you do a search and you're somewhere, it will tell you the nearest shop you can go to buy the thing you've searched for. And this presents a unique testing challenge to us. And this is all about being able to emulate location. So it's possible to, for example, record GPX files, the file location-based files, and then load them back into device SDKs, and then emulate where you've been, and edit those files so that you can change where the device thinks you are, enabling you to test without having to always be walking around or always be in a particular location. So if you're testing those, think about what you can do there. We will certainly in the future see more transactions from a financial perspective happening on mobile. So consumers are increasingly moving over to mobile for financial transactions. And this means a number of things for testing. So mobile commerce getting increasingly big. I mean, users still don't trust mobile as much as desktop for commerce. I think there's still quite a lot of browsing happens on mobile, but then the purchase decision actually happens on desktop. But this is changing. And what this really means is it means security is becoming more and more important on mobile. And we're seeing an increasing amount of malware, for example, on mobile, particularly around Android. It's a little easier to get malware into the Google Play Store than it is into the Apple App Store. And also, it's much easier to sideload applications in Android, i.e. copy them onto the device bypassing the App Store. So that increases the possibilities for malware. So think about security issues and things, but think about simple stuff like browser security and cookies and security settings and application permissions. These are all really, really important. And there's still some kind of high-profile companies and high-profile cases where people are getting this wrong. I mean, you've probably seen some of these examples here. The Virus Shield Android app, bit of malware, which over 30,000 people paid $4 for that app, and it did absolutely nothing except collect information. It got a lot of 5-star reviews, rather bizarrely, and until the developer got found out. This is an example here. There's a security vulnerability on Nest thermostats at the moment around the USB, and I think it's because companies are not still focusing quite so much on their mobile security. There was a big example earlier in the year from Starbucks where the Starbucks app was storing the login credentials, the location information on the devices in plain text. And the problem with mobile is, or an additional problem, is mobile phones get stolen. So people carry them around and they get stolen often. You shouldn't be storing information in plain text on devices. And so as testers, we need to make sure that companies are viewing security properly, because a company's brand is a brand, no matter what platform that brand is visible on. So think about storage on the device, storage on the server. Think about maybe man-in-the-middle attacks and the security of the channel as well. Think about what happens, as I mentioned earlier, if you uninstall an application. Does all the user data get removed? Because if it doesn't, and it's something like, say for example, the Outlook app on Android, storing the emails unencrypted. So somebody could steal your phone and use the Android SDK to very, very easily remove your emails. The good news is that there's some very, very good information on the OWASP website about this, owasp.org, and they also have a very good virtual machine called MobiSec, which you can practice security testing for mobile on. So I'd definitely recommend you head over there and check that out. And the final thing about security on mobile is about application permissions. So when you download an application, it will ask you for a set of permissions. Are they appropriate? As a tester, you should be looking at that and seeing whether they are appropriate. And also for mobile websites, this example here from CNN Money, asking me to turn off private browsing to see the site content. Is that appropriate? Makes me feel a bit odd. Maybe I'll just head over to the desktop site and carry out my transaction instead. Also in the future, we are going to see smartphones everywhere. So the feature phone, let's be honest, will all but disappear. And smartphones everywhere means the potential for your application everywhere. And for testing, this means maybe more testing of localization, so different languages, different character sets, maybe languages like Arabic languages that go from right to left rather than left to right. Always tends to cause UI bugs. So think about whether the app is available in different languages and what happens if you change language. What happens if you change the language of the keyboard, for example? Does it still work with your application? And this is kind of closely tied in as well with accessibility. So accessibility is becoming more and more important for mobile as well, as there are more and more mobile users. So how readable is your application if it's being viewed with a very large font? Maybe there's some voice activation or voice control for the application. Do the images have text alternatives? There are a couple of tools, TalkBack for Android and VoiceOver for iOS, that you can use to test applications for accessibility. I definitely recommend you check those out. Because the key thing here, and in the future, increasingly, media usage is changing, and how we consume media is changing. I mean, this set of stats here from Ofcom show the purple lines on the left-hand side is how people watch TV. So the purple line's TV sets. So if you look at the number of 65 plus, half people are watching TV on TV sets. But then when you come down to the 16 to 24s, it's only 24%. Whereas they use 23% are watching them on another device. Now, another device here is clearly going to be a mobile device. So they're using them more, and those interactions and the interactions between applications is greater than it used to be. So you need to take that into account in testing. And we sent a lot of messages in the UK last year, and it was really the growth was driven by messaging apps, not by SMS. The average person on a messaging app sends 46 messages a day. So that's potentially 46 times your application could be interrupted by a messaging app. Test for it. Because if you don't, your users are going to find that one pretty quick. Wearables are also driving voice activation much more. So Siri for iOS and Google Now for Android. And there's also voice activation called Tana coming on Windows Phone as well. And you may find yourself in a situation where your application that you're testing is voice activated. You may have to start talking for your testing. Should be a bit of fun. So wearables are particularly driving this because smartwatches and Google Wear, for example, typically talked to rather than typed because the screens are so much smaller. So what happens with your app when you activate voice? Even if your app is not voice activated, what happens if you activate voice to do something else? And then you return to the app. Does it still work okay? Because it's no longer okay to have a bad mobile presence. Company reputation is really on the line here. And so you really need to make sure you don't really have something like this. If I browse to something like this, and this may look quite big on your desktop screen as part of the webinar, but imagine I was using a 3.5-inch screen. It really wouldn't work very well. And what this means is companies are using responsive design, particularly for mobile websites, more. And the good news is there's a whole bunch of useful tools, like this one here, which you can use to test responsive designs within the browser before you even get to testing on a real mobile device. And really worth using, really worth doing a search in Google for responsive design tools if you're testing a mobile website. So that's kind of the future and where mobile is going, but what about you? So what about your mobile testing future? Well, what I'll do now is I'll kind of help you avoid some of the common mobile testing gotchas. So if you're just starting off, or even if you've been testing for a while, help you understand where we're going with mobile and maybe some stuff that could trip you up. So the first one, only testing on simulators. So using simulators and browser emulation, it's tempting because they're found within the SDKs and they're a good start and they're cheap or free, but they don't fully emulate the device. So okay to start with, but they're not recreating exactly how a device functions. And it's kind of the same with browser emulation. So you could do a user agent switch within a desktop browser and it would reformat your site to look like it was on a mobile. And Chrome, the developer tools in Chrome are very good for this. Now browser's rendering the page differently, but it's still rendering the page on a desktop. So as a starting point for purely UI testing, okay, but don't use them as the only test or the only device, for want of a better way of putting it, that you test on before you launch. That's very risky. So you need some real devices. As mentioned earlier, you could buy all of these devices, or you could rent them. You could use an open device lab because you can't pick them all. So choose a few at the top and the bottom and in the middle. You could consider some device ranking, so look at what your users are using, for example. Don't forget your customers use your app. And don't forget real devices and device libraries are expensive. So set that expectation in the project you're working that this is something that uses budget and it's something that is very much required. Another mobile testing gotcha, and this is often a big one, it's staying in the office. So do not just test here. I mean, this is a nice office. It's nice and kind of quiet and clean, and it has people like Mr. Dan Ashby there testing in perfect Wi-Fi and under artificial light. Now your users are probably not testing in perfect Wi-Fi under artificial light. They're probably on a train or in a pub or walking around. That means the network performance is probably going up and down, and how your application performs there, and also how usable your application is changes. So get out there and test like your users. Find some routes where you can walk around. Consider recording them with a fitness application so that if you do find any problems, you know where you found them and you can go back and recreate if you need to. Users are not in your office. A great place to test is at train stations, where frequently networks are overloaded. And on trains is brilliant because trains typically move quickly through the mobile networks, doing swapping between cells and swapping between maybe 2G and 3G networks. When you get to a station, sometimes they pick Wi-Fi back up again. So testing applications on the train, brilliant place to test. If you're lucky, maybe you get to go to the middle of nowhere and see what happens to your application. So understand where you can be, where there's what's called a dead spot, so where there's no mobile reception at all. And if you can't do that, consider the use of a microwave. A microwave is a brilliant place to lose a mobile reception. So you can stick your phone into the microwave, shut the door, and it will very quickly lose the reception. So it's another good way of doing things. It's essentially the Faraday cage effect. If you find it's not losing reception, you probably want a new microwave. Another gotcha, and a thing to remember to do, forgetting about battery life. Battery life is incredibly important to mobile users. So applications that make battery life worse get very bad reviews and very visibly bad reviews and typically get deleted very quickly. So it's very, very important to think about the effect battery life has and use maybe some of the tools in the different operating systems or the SDKs in order to profile the energy usage of your app, because you certainly don't want it making the energy usage significantly worse. Another gotcha is forgetting that it takes time to submit applications in the first place. So it can take 2 weeks to get something live in the App Store as compared with half a day for Google. Now this can play to your advantage if you choose to put a device into the App Store and then do some of the testing while it's in the submission process. However, don't forget when it goes live to test downloading and installing it, because that's a very difficult thing to test beforehand with the launch, impossible with the launched version. And the last thing you want is to find that consumers find that they can't download it and you wonder why you have no downloads. Another gotcha is ignoring operating system updates. So operating systems get updated and quite frequently they introduce APIs that are not backwards compatible, and therefore you need to regression test apps or websites before OS updates go live. So get on the developer program and get early versions of the OSs before they're released and do a bit of regression testing around that, because it gives you then the opportunity to adapt an application prior to that operating system version going live. Because users update quite quickly, particularly on iOS. When a new version comes out, they update extremely quickly and you could suddenly find an application doesn't work anymore. Bear in mind also that carriers often control update cycles, and this is particularly true for Android. So the mobile network carriers can slow down the rollout. So don't assume that, say, because the latest version of Android has just come out, that everybody's updated. The latest version, KitKat, for example, is still only on about 20% of Android devices at the moment, even though it's been out for a pretty long while. Also handy to decide beforehand, so when a mobile project is being defined, how many operating system versions that the team is going to support, because this can help drive how much you test and what you test on. Next mobile testing gotcha, confusing development with live. Now this can be particularly a problem when you're testing things like push updates, for example. There's an example here from the BBC from last month, for example, where I've almost made this mistake myself, I must admit. It's very easy to push an update somewhere where it maybe shouldn't go. And bear in mind the number of users a popular mobile application is going to have and the impact this is going to have. This particular case went viral very, very quickly. It's all over the social networks. So just be careful that dev means dev and live means live. Don't mix them up. And then, as I touched upon at the beginning of this webinar, don't think mobile test automation is like the web test automation at the moment. So we are not where we are in the web currently in mobile. So it could be viewed as the holy grail to solving the fragmentation problem. It's okay, we'll just test on everything with automation. We're about 6 years behind, I'd say, at the moment. And a good strategy first is to think about pushing more for unit and integration tests. So don't think that you need to drive everything via the mobile UI, because the tools are not completely mature at the moment. So there's some options here. This is available on my website, so I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but suffice to say there are a number of solutions. None of them, I think, at the moment are perfect. Some of them are good. My top tips, if you're going to go for automation, firstly, determine if you require cross-platform support. So if you want to test both iOS and Android, for example, that will drive which automation solution you pick. Try and avoid tools that use embedded servers or agents because they're altering production code. Some of the automation solutions do that. Look for tools with active online communities. You will need help. These tools all require workarounds in some cases. So look for the active online communities and consider the future. So consider what's going to happen with tools. So my picks here, Appium is a good bet. So it's cross-platform, the user community is very well supported, and it's about to be closely integrated into Selenium 3 as well, when Selenium 3 is launched, hopefully at Selenium Conference. iOS driver, if you don't need that cross-platform support, again, a well-supported user community and going into Selenium 3. And then thirdly, Calabash. So if you're a Ruby person, Calabash is good. Calabash integrates really nicely with Cucumber as well. The user community is active. It does require a user agent, which maybe knocks it down the list a little bit, but it is still heavily used in the field. The BBC, for example, use Calabash a lot. They get a lot of good usage from Calabash. So Calabash, another good option. So, kind of pulling this whole webinar together, if you just want a single slide that kind of gives my top tips for mobile test strategy going forwards. So for the current state we are with mobile testing and the future. First one, understand your potential user. So get access to analytics if you can, and understand how your user is using your platform, the platforms and the devices, how they'll use your app or your website. So understand as much about potential users as possible, because hopefully there will be a lot of them, and a lot of them will be different. Understand what operating system versions are being used and when new ones are coming, so you can regression test for that. Test using simulators, real devices, and test using users. So think about how you can best spread your testing across simulators, devices, and users. Understand the cost of automation. Use automation. Automation is good for precisely the same reasons it's good on the web, but just be aware that the solutions are not where desktops and web solutions are right now, and combine it with unit and integration testing. And finally, mobile projects are very typically short and fast-paced. So definitely use an exploratory approach to your manual testing. And the great thing about mobile, ultimately, this is a quote given to me by a project manager in Nokia: be proud, your work will soon be in the hands of millions. And this is the key thing about mobile, that makes it a real testing challenge, is that millions and millions of people are going to use your applications. And I think that's great. So, I'll be taking questions now over in Test Huddle. So head over to Test Huddle, and I hope to hear your questions there, and hopefully answer a few of them for you, and hopefully see some of you at EuroSTAR in Dublin in November. Thank you. Bye.